Once Upon a Time. In Lansing. By Bruce Philip Miller. Copyright 2021 Bruce Philip Miller, all rights reserved. First edition 2021. In memory of Mimi and Martha. For my family. Once upon a time. I was close to turning 7 when I first heard the name Joseph Gleason. It happened like this: my mother and I had just left the Bank of Lansing and she told me her first job out of high school was working on the 4th floor of the building for him. She said he helped my grandmother with her house. Over the years Gleason's name would come up from time to time, but I did not really understand the role he played in our family until a night in 1968 when all my aunts and uncles were at my grandmother's house to finish settling her estate. They began to reminisce about their younger selves and growing up. One thing was soon clear: they each viewed the past they shared from their own vantage point. They saw the same events differently. They didn't agree on key features of their own history. I found the discussion amusing and vowed to write it down before going to bed, thinking it would make a great story. But I didn't write it down. For decades the story whispered, "You better do it soon, Bruce, you never know." Marooned by plague, I decided to try. First, I needed to figure out more about this Gleason character. The more I dug into his story, the more interesting things became. He grew up south of Grand Ledge on a farm. His father was a Civil War veteran who died not long after the end of the war. His mother moved the family to Lansing prior to the turn of the 20th century, and he even attended St. Mary's, where I went to school and church. He was a Democrat, an alternate to the 1932 Democratic Convention, served a term on city council, and after a successful business career he was appointed receiver of Capital National Bank at age 69 in 1934. My grandmother's few papers included documents with his name on them, and scrutinizing them it appeared that he helped her refinance her house not long after my mother started working for him at the bank. The refinancing arrangement reduced my grandmother's debt and house payment by 2/3. I wasn't sure how he pulled that off, but the difference was significant. The archives of the State Journal have a robust search feature, and I found myself drawn deep into the 1910s, the 20s, and finally the 30s when Gleason was appointed receiver of the bank. News articles showed that Gleason immediately came into conflict with men who ran companies with money and collateral now frozen at the bank, along with the accounts of thousands of everyday citizens. These men complained that Gleason was not giving them information they wanted about the sale of assets and the status of collections on loans the bank made when it was solvent. They claimed that poor pensioners in Lansing were suffering because of his inaction, that he simply sat around with his feet up on a mahogany desk twiddling his thumbs while people suffered. This characterization was both at odds with what I believed about the man and with stories I found about Gleason heralding his generosity, including numerous short pieces written by a journalist named Earl R. Pitt. For Earl Pitt, Joseph W. Gleason's escapades were a source of entertainment that he could share with his readers at the Journal. The details of the bank's failure were complicated, so I took a step back to try and understand them. After a review of historical documents about Capital National Bank, the causes of the national banking crisis, the nature of receiverships, and the Emergency Banking Act of 1933, I better understood what was behind the dust-up between Gleason and the corporate men, and why the Journal portrayed Gleason as someone acting like the dictators running loose in Italy and Germany. I could also see that the story of the bank and the story of my grandmother's family might be intertwined, with her family standing in for other struggling borrowers in Lansing. I've included the sources of information for this account in a bibliography in the paperback version of this account, which is available at Amazon. I also learned personal details about Gleason, his wife Mary, and their family by speaking with the 90-year-old son of Gleason's only heir. Everyone in the Benefactors is real, and everything in it happened except for 3 invented scenes that begin with the word imagine. The 3rd invented scene is the longest and is the dramatic hook upon which this account hangs. It imagines what might have caused the State Journal to reverse its editorial position about Gleason just 24 hours after directing its most pointed criticism his way. Assembling this story, I was struck by the way in which the writers at the State Journal talked about and did not talk about black people in Lansing. I knew that the hardships my grandmother and her family went through paled when set alongside those of black families. Immigrants from every nation had their challenges, but no immigrant faced what black U.S. citizens encountered then or today. Those issues are explored in Chapter 6, Marks of Identification. To be clear, the benefactors in this story include more than Gleason, who helped my grandmother, and Olds, who arguably built this city. They include my parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles whose reminiscences and lives populate this small book. Also 5 teachers from St. Mary's Cathedral School and O'Rafferty High, Sister Stephanie Lindsay, Sister Grace Schweitering, Sister Marie Antoinette Hart, Sister Rita Hawk, and Father William Fitzgerald. Part 1. The Benefactors. Chapter 1, Prosperous Beginnings. In 1896 R. Olds was a mechanic tinkering in his father's garage on River Street when he assembled the first practical horseless carriage. Olds knew he had something worth pursuing and declared he would produce them at scale if investors came forward. Olds Motor Works was born, and in short order, the company was selling more automobiles than any other brand. In 1904, Olds left the company after an argument with investors. They were eager to make a bigger, more costly version, and he wanted to sell more of the smaller cars to working men. A year later, with new investors, he formed the R. Olds Company and, before long, a second car with his name on it, or more precisely, his initials topped sales charts. Not content with the miracle of forming two successful car companies, Olds started Capital National Bank in 1906. A growing population needed homes, business and factory owners needed capital, and the bank provided it using the house or building or a company's stock as collateral. He ordered up 15,000 savings passbooks, put a penny in each, had them handed out in schools as a lesson in thrift, and encouraged children to add their nickels and dimes. Joseph W. Gleason was born a year after Olds in 1865, worked at the post office in 1882, lit out for the territory soon after, and learned the paint trade in Colorado. Bedazzled by the sight of silver being extracted from lead, he returned to Lansing and named the firm he started Silver Lead Paint. He married Mary Ryan, a traveling auditor for the Singer Sewing Machine Company, and the couple made Silver Lead the premier paint firm in the region. Joseph and Mary lived a block north of St. Mary's, and childless, were always on the lookout for a boy or girl to help with their house and yard. If you worked for them, they didn't pay you. Instead, they gave or did something for you in return. Vincent O'Leary was 12 when he started working for the Gleasons. What they did for him was raise him as their own and give him a job at Silver Lead. Mary learned about Vincent from a nun at school who said he was often beaten and locked in the basement of the house where he lived with his uncle and aunt. Gleason visited the uncle and told him that he and Mary thought it would be a good idea if the boy moved in with them. He'd be closer to school and less likely to get in trouble. Gleason was an imposing figure. Vincent's uncle did not argue. The Gleasons attended church at St. Mary's, where Father O'Rafferty encouraged parishioners to donate to his St. Anthony's Society. O'Rafferty was proud to say it helped people regardless of race or creed. He investigated each case personally to assure recipients were worthy but acknowledged he gave loafers money if it would prevent a stick-up. Frank and Martha Howdad also attended St. Mary's. They grew up 21 miles apart in the old country and met in Lansing the day of their wedding, arranged by Martha's brother in 1910. Martha was 18 when she arrived in 1907, sent by her father to work as a housekeeper for two brothers already working at Oldsmobile. Under marks of identification on her immigration record, the inspector noted and drew a picture of a small tattoo on her right hand. It was a dot surrounded by lines that resembled a peaked roof with crosses running up one side and down the other. The peaked roof symbolized the protection of home, the crosses represented the church and the dot signified Martha. Frank was a hard worker who did not abide by poor conditions at Seeger Engine Works, walked out with other men in 1912, was arrested for picketing, and spent a few nights in jail. In 1913, helping build the new St. Mary's Cathedral, Frank found the end of a 2x12-inch joist in a debris pile. It was the perfect size for a cutting board, so he smoothed its edges and gave it to Martha. In 1915 he worked for the Lansing Fuel Company and put a down payment on a house on Olds Avenue. Vincent O'Leary finished school in 1917 and was drafted into the Army, serving with the 16th Engineers in France. He wrote often to the woman he called Aunt Mary. That was the year of the national coal shortage. In December, with the crisis at its worst, Gleason visited the city official responsible for the emergency distribution of coal. He said he didn't have much himself, but he had a team, some barrels, and could spare some for people with none. He told the man he didn't want anyone in Lansing to suffer if he could prevent it. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 impacted Lansing less than other places. The journal reported cases in Michigan were 2/3 less than those in the eastern United States. None of Frank and Martha's family was impacted by the flu, though there was a child who died from a rat bite in those years. Back from the war, Vincent tried repaying Gleason money borrowed before he left. Gleason refused to take it, but Vincent insisted, saying it weighed on his conscience since he was about to do something Joseph would not like. Gleason asked him what that might be, and Vincent told him he planned to buy a motorcar. Gleason believed no working men needed one. He laughed and said that if Vincent could afford a motorcar, he guessed he could afford to pay the money he owed him. Frank worked at REO but never owned a motorcar and walked or took the trolley everywhere he went. After a year at REO, he moved on to Capital Casting. By 1920 he saved enough to take Martha and sons Joe, George, and Charlie to the old country for a visit. Bandits chased their stagecoach on the way to Frank's village, and Turks murdered a relative of his while they were off visiting Martha's family. She was eager to return home to electricity and running water. On the trip back to Lansing, she crossed paths with a gypsy who gave her the evil eye, and Martha was sure the encounter resulted in the death of her newborn son shortly after they arrived home. The First World War came to be called the war to end all wars, but it didn't. One reason it didn't was because in 1923, a survivor of World War I, Adolf Hitler, led an insurrection against the Bavarian government. He and his mob of Nazi followers were thwarted by police, and he was arrested and tried for treason. His sentence was 5 years, but he was released 9 months later. That all seemed far away to people in the United States. In Lansing, silver lead paint prospered, and in 1923 Joseph and Mary Gleason donated 4 acres of land for the new St. Lawrence Hospital. In 1924 Frank Haddad took his oldest son Joe to the parade put on by the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was becoming more visible, and parades like this one were intended to reflect positively on the group, to show them performing good works. They saw themselves as upholding traditional American values as opposed to Catholics, blacks, immigrants and Jews who, they argued, were changing American culture. Father O'Rafferty and other like-minded clergymen did not abide by such nonsense. When Klansmen passed St. Mary's during the parade, O'Rafferty called out and shamed men he recognized under hoods and capes. Olds prospered throughout this period and found new outlets for his ambitions. In 1929 Olds rode up in the bucket of the steam shovel that broke ground for the 22-story Olds Tower. He reserved the tower lobby for Capital National, commissioned brass elevator doors depicting scenes from his life, and had his private office and conference room at the top. Imagine riding the elevator up with Olds. He might use the lever to manipulate the lift like a carnival ride, amplify the hemodynamic effects of gravity on passengers and add to the dizziness people already experienced when he was around. Out the conference room windows, he could point to the factory he gave up in the fight with investors in 1904 and the REO plant south of the railroad tracks he started a year later. To the east was Sparrow Hospital, built with his philanthropy, and the Olds Engineering Building at the college. In every direction were businesses, parks, churches, schools, and working men's houses built in the boom years. Men like Gleason and Olds owned businesses and hired others to run them. Paint was easy to make: mix soil and lead, put it in a can. Cars needed more ingredients, and Olds invented the supply chain to provide them. He hired Oldsmen to keep it all running, men loyal and active in civic affairs. One was Earl Goodnow, president of Olds Atlas Drop Forge. Outside work, Goodnow raised money for the Palmer Shoe Fund for destitute school children. Gleason had Harry Hughes in charge of Silver Lead's back office and Vincent O'Leary, who managed the front. Joseph played cards at the Elks Club, dabbled in real estate, and stopped at the paint store most afternoons where if he saw something he didn't like, he'd collar the man responsible and say, "What did you do that for?" Olds' many interests included Florida real estate and yachting. He was often gone from Lansing but was a quick study and would change tack when he saw something was amiss with one of his enterprises. Imagine a hot summer evening in 1931. Cars going over the Logan Street Bridge on hot asphalt make a shoosing noise that sounds like they are driving in the rain. Frank Haddad is on his porch sipping a juice glass of homemade wine. The 3 boys are out tonight with friends, Martha, and the 3 little girls are inside, Mimi, Madeline, and newborn Emmeline, lulled to sleep by the sound of industrial hammers pounding in drop forges at either end of town. You would think the sound would keep them awake, but the pounding is steady, like a heartbeat. Lightning bugs rise and fall in the yard, and Frank can see lights are also burning atop Olds Tower. He hoists the glass in that direction. The great man might be up there tonight planning his next grand venture. Kismet. Chapter 2. Things fall apart. The day after Christmas in 1931, a rumor spread that Lansing City National Bank was low on cash. People panicked and came to get theirs out. Capital National was unaffected, but Olds, concerned the panic would spread, joined other leaders to keep City National from collapsing. The idea was for City National to merge with his larger bank. Capital National depositors would be at risk, so leaders organized 2 guarantors groups who pledged $1.5 million to protect depositors at Olds Bank. Olds accomplished the merger and averted the crisis. It did not stop the Depression. By 1932 unemployment was 25%. 1,800 Lansing families were getting sacks of flour each month from the welfare department. Then as now, if you'd borrowed money and did not make payments, the bank could take your property, sell it, pay itself and give you what was left. On January 26, a former Lansing man named DJ Meade drove up from Detroit to settle a score with Frank Gorman, Capital National's president. Behind on payments, the bank sold Meade's property, paid itself, and gave him what was left. Meade had lunch and a shave at the Roosevelt Hotel, then went to Capital National's lobby and asked for Gorman. Assistant cashier B.W. Nichols said Gorman wasn't in. Meade didn't wait for his return. He took out a pistol and shot Nichols dead. Then he walked up the west side of the bank and kept firing. The next shot was A.A. Alciser, bank vice president. Marshall Westfall, assistant cashier, jumped to Alciser's aid while Meade kept blazing away. Bank guard David Timmons and customer John Lilly were the next to fall. Then bank patron Lucille Duncan was hit, the compact in her purse deflecting the bullet. Meade then put the pistol's barrel in his mouth and killed himself. That spring Earl Goodnow reported that the Palmer Shoe Fund for Destitute Children was $800 short every month. At the time, you could buy a pair of shoes for 98 cents at Penny's. When summer came, Olds pitched a back-to-the-farm proposal calling on the state to give every unemployed person 10 acres and pre-cut lumber for a house they could build themselves. The plan went nowhere. The 1932 presidential election was on people's minds, and momentum was building to replace Hoover with Roosevelt. That fall Gleason campaigned for FDR for president and Claude Cady for Congress. Earl R. Pitt, a longtime Lansing journalist, and friend of Gleason, wrote in his column that Joseph even bought a vote. Seeing a stalled car in the road, Pitt said Gleason pushed it with his REO to a repair shop. The owner tried paying him, but Joseph refused the money. Asking the man's address, he discovered it was in Cady's district and said, "If you raise your right hand and swear to cast as many votes as possible for Cady, I'll consider myself paid." Before FDR took office in 1933, a bank panic started in Detroit then spread statewide. President Hoover sent the Commerce Secretary to ask Henry Ford to loan two Detroit banks money. Ford, the largest depositor in both banks, said no. He'd helped before but this time said the banks needed to find someone else. If they didn't, he said he'd pull his money out. Michigan's Governor William Comstock knew Ford making a run on his own banks would be a catastrophe and ordered a bank holiday on Valentine's Day, 1933, to prevent it. Olds, vacationing in Mexico, returned immediately, urged calm, and a return to the use of checks. The panic spread nationwide. Roosevelt took office just as banks were experiencing the worst financial catastrophe in history. Roosevelt temporarily closed banks and urged Congress to pass his Emergency Banking Act so solvent banks could reopen with federal deposit insurance. FDR's Comptroller of Currency told examiners to value bank assets at their intrinsic worth, not depressed market prices so more banks could pass solvency tests. The Comptroller told reopened banks to ignore loan payments missed by borrowers until further notice. By May 1933, most banks were open, but Capital National fell short of solvency despite relaxed standards. Olds and the bank directors petitioned for a conservator and announced plans for a new bank they would call Lansing National. Nathan Hull, former Michigan Milk Producers Association president, was appointed conservator. He set up an office at the tower and hired former Capital National employees to help with the work. One was Marshall Westfall, who kept Alciser from bleeding to death during Meade's rampage. Watching these developments was Harry E. Moore, president of the Lansing Company. Moore had pledged securities in the 1931 merger. He suspected Capital National was insolvent itself as early as 1929, filed a lawsuit claiming fraud, and demanded the return of his securities. Other guarantors then joined the suit. Federal reviewers told Olds they would not issue the new bank's charter unless he canceled a $1 million lease with Capital National for space in the tower. Olds did, and in March 1934, the Comptroller approved the charter for the new bank and a federally backed loan from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The loan was equal to 40% of depositor money frozen at Capital National since Valentine's Day 1933. The Comptroller did not allow Lansing National to take Capital National under its wing. Instead, he ordered Capital National into receivership and appointed Joseph Gleason receiver. The RFC loan was welcomed, the appointment of Gleason as the receiver was not. Pitt had once written that Gleason went everywhere with a little fox terrier named Sailor. He called the dog the Democrat who wears no man's collar. That label was now applied to Gleason by the men losing control of the old bank. Asked about his new job, Gleason said he had a lot to learn. Hull had started the distribution of the loan, and Gleason would finish the process. Terms called for each depositor to get 40% of the money frozen in their account. Atlas, with $2.5 million frozen, received a $1 million payment. There were 37,000 other accounts. 15,000 were the so-called penny accounts of school children. Hull had received permission to exclude these from the distribution due to the cost of processing so many small checks. The loan money would assure that everyone else received 40% of what was listed in their account. Money to repay the taxpayer-backed loan would come from collections on loans and from the sale of property in default before the order to ignore slow loans was issued. The bank also held notes for loans made to individuals and businesses. The comptroller had asked all bankers and receivers for a report on the status of every single loan. The report would be created by listing loans under headings labeled safe, slow, doubtful, or loss. A slow loan was one where a borrower regularly missed payments. Loans in the loss column meant a borrower exceeded the limit of missed payments and was in default. The reports from bankers and receivers would provide a rough idea of how many homeowners would be at risk of default and foreclosure if the order to ignore slow loans was lifted. The bank was also holding $1.5 million in securities pledged by Moore, Olds, and other guarantors in the 1931 merger between Capital National and City National. Gleason could not sell the securities because of Moore's lawsuit. If settled in favor of the receivership, Gleason could sell the collateral and return money to depositors. In preparation for the trial seeking the return of the securities pledged in the merger, Moore's lawyers asked Gleason for access to records from the old bank. Gleason refused their request. This was justifiable since the receiver's job was to protect the $1.5 million for depositors, not help Moore prove fraud. Moore's lawyers next asked a judge to force Gleason to comply with their subpoena. And why not? Without records, proving fraud would be impossible. As the winter of 1934 turned to spring, Earl Goodnow, president of Atlas Drop Forge, appealed to Lansing business people and citizens for donations to start a citywide recreation program. He warned of problems ahead for thousands of Lansing children idled by New Deal labor laws. New laws reduced the number of hours they could legally work from 60 to 40 per week. Joe and George Haddad were out of school, working when and where they could. Charlie, in 11th grade, was doing the same. Mimi, Madeline, and Emmeline were 10, 8, and 3. Frank Haddad was unwell. Tuberculosis, an occupational hazard at Capital Casting, took his life in June at age 44. He left his widow Martha a small life insurance policy and a paid-up house. That summer strong winds in the drought-stricken southern plains of the United States created dust storms from Texas to Nebraska. The storms ruined crops, uprooted people and brought about government intervention in the form of introduction of erosion-preventing farming methods. Winds of war were also blowing across Europe. In July, Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss was assassinated by Nazis. A month later, Hitler united the chancellorship and presidency under the new title of Führer. In November, Lee Richardson, an RFC official, met with Gleason and Marshall Westphal to talk about the status of the loan. After work, the three went pheasant hunting at Gleason's farm. Pitt wrote that Joseph, being in a state of financial decrepitude, no doubt owing to the New Deal, failed to buy a license. Instead of hunting, he ran through the brush, scaring up birds for the others to shoot. He chided Gleason for taking the risk, saying, "Some of the boys with notes the receiver is trying to collect might have willfully and enthusiastically taken a shot at the old dog." That same month, Martha Haddad took over the lease on a small grocery store on South Cedar Street. She used money from Frank's life insurance for rent, inventory, and fixtures. The idea was for Joe, George, and Charlie to operate the store to support the family, with George having primary responsibility as the proprietor. Meanwhile, workers in Washington tabulated the results of reports on the status of loans. Congress learned a third of them were slow. The percentage was sobering and confirmed fears that lifting the policy too soon would result in more foreclosures and homelessness for people with no work or whose employment was sporadic. The comptroller sent letters to receivers and bankers, giving them the option to continue to ignore slow loans until conditions improved. The letter made clear that doing so would be in accord with the Act's intent. Bankers and receivers had discretion over when and when not to apply the option. They could also extend the term of loans, adjust interest rates, or reduce the principal balances to reflect lower home values. Borrowers could still find themselves in danger of foreclosure if a receiver concluded they could pay and were shirking their responsibility. A group of Capital National's largest depositors asked to meet with Gleason. They wanted to receive regular updates on the receivership. Gleason explained he was a federally appointed official, not an employee of the bank, and denied their request. They took their disappointment to the paper, complaining that Gleason would not give them information about assets, liabilities, or what he was doing with loans the bank made when it was solvent. Soon after that, they formed a committee with the stated purpose of protecting the interest of depositors large and small. Earl Goodnow, president of Atlas Drop Forge, was secretary of the committee, and other members included former conservator Hull and the current and past publisher of the State Journal. In December 1934, a judge ruled against Moore and the guarantors, voiding the subpoena his lawyers gave Gleason for records. Lawyers announced they would appeal the ruling to the Michigan Supreme Court. The Depositors Committee made an announcement too: it would petition the comptroller to end the receivership. Gleason was taking too long to liquidate assets, they said, and legal fees were eating up money that could be returned to depositors. Other banks in receivership were using local trustee groups to manage liquidation, and they wanted to follow that model. They met with the comptroller's staff in Washington in May 1935 and made their pitch. After the meeting, the comptroller's team told the committee they would discuss their plan with the comptroller and get back to them. Summer came and went without a decision from the comptroller about the Depositor Committee's plan, and the committee's frustration found its way into the journal. Gleason was put under the microscope by committee members who complained that he could follow his own ideas, make any expenditures, in fact, do as he likes at any or all times without agreement on the part of depositors. An editorial in the journal called the committee's plan vital to local industry and workers' futures. It mentioned but did not name a firm with $2.5 million of its reserves frozen when the bank closed in 1933. It did not disclose that the taxpayer-backed loan had already returned 40% of that money to the company. Another article claimed Detroit banks in receivership were getting loans without federal strings. It did not reveal that the loans were from private investors and solvent banks, not the federal government. Also printed was the committee's suspicion that Gleason was working behind the scenes to scuttle their plan. Pensioners were dragged into the fray with the paper asserting that under the localized liquidation plan, relief might come to those discouraged helpless depositors, but instead of relief, governmental red tape hoists its feet upon its mahogany desk and twiddles its thumbs and is deaf in both ears. How pensioners were to receive money under the committee plan was an elaborate shell game. The committee wanted the federal government to loan money to the local trustee group. The group would use the loan to pay a handful of large corporate depositors all of the funds remaining in their frozen accounts. Then the corporate depositors would loan some of what they received back to the local trustee group so it could pay off the pensioners. In return for this so-called generosity, the local group would receive interest on the money lent until the local trustee group liquidated the bank's assets. Unmentioned was that ending the receivership would also end Gleason's tenure and create uncertainty about the policy of ignoring slow loans. The local trustee group would decide whose loans to ignore and whose to deem a loss subject to foreclosure. On the heels of this article, Olds and all former Capital National directors received registered letters from Gleason. The letters ordered them to appear in his office at 10 a.m. Saturday, October 26, where he would present them with a demand to repay illegal dividends and loans they approved when the bank was solvent. Announcing the summons, the Journal noted that more than one person who received it thought Gleason was exacting retribution for criticism of how he was managing the receivership. The publisher invited Gleason to take as much space as he needed, free of charge, and share his thoughts about the committee plan. Gleason said only that depositors would soon learn about the status of the receivership. It seemed as though dictators were everywhere. Mussolini had recently started a war with Ethiopia. At Main Street School, a teacher asked if anyone could name Ethiopia's leader. Mimi Haddad raised her hand. She was called on and answered, Haile Selassie. Chapter 3. The Democrat Who Wears No Man's Collar. Imagine a fall evening. A tall man leaves his home on Walnut Street with a little fox terrier at his side. He pauses at St. Mary's Cathedral for a visit, walks a few blocks, and enters the lobby of Olds Tower. Greeting a young elevator operator, he asks about his family. They chat as the elevator moves swiftly to the top floor and a conference room where R.E. Olds is waiting along with the journalist Hurl Pitt. Pitt, a friend of Gleason and a confidant of Olds, is rumored to be the reporter the Journal assigns when Olds wants his opinion in the paper. Pitt has arranged the meeting at the behest of Gleason. The three exchange pleasantries, admire the city out the conference room windows, then get down to business. Olds asks what Gleason can tell him about the summons he's issued. Gleason says he is not at liberty to talk about the matter. An auditor will address it at the meeting on October 26. The awkward moment passes, and Gleason says he asked for the meeting to talk about the Depositors Committee plan and to convey a proposal from the comptroller. He tells Olds the plan the committee presented and may caught comptroller staff off guard. They expected to see a proposal to have the receivership taken over by an outside investor or an eligible bank. Instead, the plan presented was one they could not recommend the comptroller approve. Olds asked Gleason why this was the case. Gleason told him there were three reasons. The first was that the committee wanted the federal government to loan money to the local trustee group without the conditions required by Congress. The comptroller could do this if a failed bank's assets were less than $30,000, but Capital National's were in the millions. The second had to do with the committee's plan for the loan. Gleason took a news article out of his pocket and handed it to Olds. It was the article explaining how pensioners would receive relief under the committee plan. He directed Olds' attention to a section that said the loan money would provide 100% relief to corporate depositors, who would then loan some of the money back to the committee to pay off pensioners. Gleason said the controller's staff told the committee in May that this was not allowable. Federal loan money had to be distributed equally to all depositors in proportion to the amounts in their frozen accounts. The third reason was the committee's plan to give corporate borrowers control over collateral they had put up for loans. They wanted to sell the deflated assets and buy different stocks in hopes they would go up in value. Gleason said the idea was novel but impermissible. If the new stocks went down instead of up and, God forbid, corporations defaulted on their loans, taxpayers and other depositors would be on the hook for losses, not the people who made the poor investments. He said the staff could have told the committee no immediately, but there were hearings underway on the Hill about loosening regulations. After consulting with the comptroller, the decision was to wait until after the hearings before making a judgment. The hearings produced no significant changes, and the office, busy with other work, neglected to get back with the committee. The oversight was regrettable, but it did not change anything. Then Gleason explained that the comptroller was always looking for ways to have one less bank to oversee. Staff already had their hands full with 1,400 in receivership, and more were failing each month. Gleason told Olds that when the steady stream of news about the committee's dissatisfaction with the receivership reached Washington, he and the comptroller talked about a way for the receivership to end. That way was to involve an outside investor or an eligible bank. Lansing National Bank was ineligible due to the risks presented by Moore's lawsuit, but Gleason told Olds there was no reason Olds could not use his own money to take Capital National out of receivership. If he did this, he could delegate authority to manage the receivership to anyone he wanted. He could allow the corporations to engage in stock speculation with their collateral and control what managers did with loans the bank made when it was still solvent. Gleason said the comptroller could draw up an agreement to end federal oversight in short order. All Olds needed to do was agree to accept financial responsibility. Then Gleason shook hands with Olds and Pitt, bid them a good evening, and went home to marry. After Gleason left, Olds walked to the window and looked out over the city. He knew there was talk about using the old bank as leverage in the fight with union organizers. If union supporters with loans at the old bank were threatened with layoff or termination and knew the local trustee group could foreclose on them, they might be less enthusiastic about supporting the union. He understood that Fordmen were using this tactic in Detroit. Olds considered it morally objectionable, repugnant, something he would not allow in Lansing. It might be advantageous to sell deflated stocks held as collateral for company loans and buy other stocks in hopes of a continued rise in the market. But if their value went down, the new collateral could be worth less than the old. The summons from Gleason also brought uncertainty. The charge of making illegal loans and dividends was serious, but Olds believed it was without merit. Moore's case before the Supreme Court was a different matter. Olds would be better off if Moore lost, as it would free up to $1.5 million for depositors. Some of that was Olds' money, but only some. If the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Moore and the fraud case went to trial, it could expose Olds to significantly more liability, perhaps even criminal charges. He looked out over the city his ingenuity and ambition built when he was younger. He had just turned 71. Winter was coming. Leaving the receivership in the hands of Gleason and the federal government made sense. It put a tourniquet on his potential losses. Olds sat down and talked to Pitt about an article for the next day's paper. The meeting portrayed his fiction, but the contextual variables are not. Setting the imagined meeting to the side, something did happen. Just 24 hours after publishing its most astringent criticism, the journal reversed its editorial position. An unsigned article on the front page of the journal said Joseph W. Gleason is in no way to be blamed for the government's policy. The real problems, it said, were government rules and poor timing. The article said that if bureaucrats had approved the local liquidation plan in May, owners of stock used as collateral for loans could have exchanged low-performing equities for stocks that went up this summer. These stocks could have been sold in October, with borrowers paying their debt to the bank with money left over. The reason that didn't happen, the article said, was that the government looks upon such shifts as speculative. The article presented a single element of the committee's plan in a favorable light, predicted its success with 20/20 hindsight, and made it abundantly clear that the time had passed to take advantage of the opportunity. It also said the former directors would meet with Gleason as ordered but would defend themselves against the charge of wrongdoing and even take the government to court if necessary. Only one person would speak like this on behalf of all former directors, R.E. Olds. Was the piece written to showcase Olds' opinion? No one is alive to say. Could Olds have brought about the abrupt change in the paper's position? Without a doubt, he could. In 1935 Lansing was still Olds' town. The October 26 meeting took place, and the journal reported Olds and other directors believed an auditor simply misunderstood the records. To clear things up, a committee would prepare a letter to the comptroller. The paper never wrote another word about the comptroller's demand that Olds and other directors repay illegal loans and dividends. As for the committee plan, a short article appeared later, referencing a letter from the comptroller that said the delay in responding to the plan was caused by the comptroller's office, not the committee. On January 6, 1936, the Michigan Supreme Court upheld the dismissal of Moore's claim saying Gleason, a federal official, had done nothing wrong in refusing to honor the subpoena. The court ruled the guarantor agreement was valid. Moore and others might lose money, or their collateral might be worth more than when they pledged it. The answer to that question would not be known until the securities were sold, something Gleason could do now that the case was decided. Gleason moved his office out of the tower and into the City National Building, and Pitt wrote a homing pigeon with a band on its leg made a crash landing on the ledge outside Joseph's office window. The bird didn't leave, so Gleason put out food and water, leaving his window open for it to come inside and roost. Pitt wrote that the bird stayed until its condition improved, unlike raging debtors who do not visit the receiver's office unless officially summoned. That summer unemployment fell to 17%. Hitler's Aryan Supermen were humiliated by Jesse Owens and other black Americans in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Hitler, Mussolini and Japan's Hirohito formed an alliance which sent a clear signal to the rest of the world about what lay ahead. In October, Roosevelt, running for a second term, was in Lansing as part of a whistle-stop tour. He gave a short speech from the back of the train at the South Washington rail station next to the REO factory. Mimi Haddad was in the crowd straining to hear Roosevelt talk about the importance of continuing policies that were aiding in the recovery. In November of 1936, in a bid to protect her young daughters from the goings-on at a social club on nearby Cowles Avenue, Martha Haddad made an offer on a house several blocks north of Haddad's grocery. The offer was contingent on a list of repairs and refurbishments itemized by Charlie Haddad in neatly typed single-space on 3 sheets of onion skin paper. Martha converted the family home on Olds Avenue into a rooming house to produce income, and the family moved to their new home on Cedar Street. Madeline and Mimi started attending a new school. Madeline sat across the aisle from a boy named Malcolm whose father, a minister in Lansing, was run over by a streetcar in September 1931. The day after Christmas, a belated present arrived for Capital National depositors, an $800,000 settlement from Moore, other guarantors, and Capital National shareholders. The money allowed Gleason to issue a 100% payoff for depositors with accounts of $200 or less, including the 15,000 school children. Times were changing. In 1937, a sit-down strike closed REO for 6 weeks. In June, thousands of workers gathered at Michigan and Washington Avenues in a labor holiday. Gleason had a bird's-eye view from his 4th-floor office in the City National Building. Charlie Haddad won second place and $75 in the Fisher Body Craftsman Guild Napoleonic Coach Building Competition. Gleason's dog died in 1937, and Pitt eulogized him, saying, "Sailor, who had never been on a ship, is being mourned by Gleason the way some of the bank's creditors mourn depression, stock market losses and deflated hopes of great riches." In November of 1937, against their mother's wishes, the Haddad boys decided not to renew the lease for the store and listed its inventory and fixtures for sale. All 3 had better jobs. Charlie was also taking college classes. The store took up too much time and produced too little money. Progress made on increasing employment came to a halt when a recession hit in 1938 and unemployment rose to 19%. On the sports front, Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling for the heavyweight championship and Joe Haddad cheered. In Germany, Hitler continued persecution of Jews. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, seeking to prevent another world war, undertook a policy of appeasement, allowing Hitler to occupy Czechoslovakia. He returned from a meeting with Hitler declaring he'd achieved peace in our time. Orson Welles created a panic on Halloween when he broadcast a radio play of War of the Worlds as though it were a news story. In January of 1939, a horror story in Europe was getting worse and gaining momentum. Hitler warned that if Jewish financiers started a war with Germany, the result would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. In April of that year, Contralto Marian Anderson was denied use of Constitution Hall for a concert by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Her race was the reason. Eleanor Roosevelt immediately resigned from the DAR and offered Anderson the use of the Lincoln Memorial for the concert. Madeline Haddad won a contest put on by the Gladmer Theater that involved picking the top movies of the year. She came in second and received 6 months of free admissions to the theater. During these years, the O'Learys and the Gleasons often visited each other after church. At the Gleasons, there were milkshakes for the children. At the O'Learys, Vincent and Joseph played ferocious games of two-handed pinochle punctuated by shouts of "take that" as they pounded cards onto the table. Chapter 4. The end of the receivership. After Germany invaded Poland, England declared war on Germany and the Second World War was at hand. Factories converted to war production. Jobs, scarce since 1930, were plentiful, though no one found joy or took comfort in the reason. Pitt wrote a dog named Nick was now making rounds with Gleason. Nick's owner, Tommy McFarlane, a neighbor on nearby Ionia Street, enlisted and needed someone to look after the dog. After Pearl Harbor, with dread and determination, more men and women left to fight the Axis. Lansing hummed around the clock as factories made trucks, guns, ammunition, airplane propellers, and other armaments. In January 1942, there was a fire at the Haddads' rooming house on Olds Avenue. Martha, months behind on payments for her home on Cedar Street and now without regular income from the rooming house, had a problem. Joe and George, with families and mortgages of their own, were in a poor position to help. Charlie expected to be drafted any day. Gleason sold the bank's last asset, the City National Building. Funds from its sale would constitute the final payment to depositors in the end of the receivership. The last tasks were carried out with the help of a new employee, Mildred Haddad. Mimi was 17. A January graduate of Eastern High School. She was recommended for the job by her teachers, but Gleason also remembered her mother from St. Mary's. When the work was finished, Joseph helped Mimi find another job. He also learned about the boarding house fire and that her mother was behind on house payments. Martha Haddad's loan was not with Capital National. Gleason contacted the lender and negotiated a reduction in the principal balance in return for the promise of an immediate payoff. Then he arranged a private party loan to provide the funds to pay off the original lender. Mrs. Haddad now owed less money and had a lower monthly payment. Mrs. Haddad sold the boarding house in June and Charlie Haddad entered the Army Air Corps. Mrs. Haddad paid off the private loan and lived the rest of her life free of house payments. Men from Silver Lead carried Gleason's desk from the City National Building to the paint store, and he closed the office. The desk is still in use at what is now called O'Leary Paint. He and his staff returned 91% of account holder money, well above the 58% average of all receivers in the era. In August 1944, Gleason ordered coal for the winter. The worker shortage left it up to him to move all 14 tons to his basement. He was 79 years old. Pitt wrote, "Comrade Gleason emerged, covered with soot and dripping with sweat. Difference between Mr. Gleason's perspiration and that of the boys sweated by him as receiver was temperature. Joseph's was good and hot. That of the brothers who had faced him when he was receiver was generally cold and clammy." The same worker shortage that turned Gleason into a coal hauler caused factories to recruit women in 1944. Mrs. Haddad hired an Oldsmobile, working until she reached retirement age, earning Social Security and a pension. She became a naturalized citizen in 1945. In August 1945 the Journal reported with fanfare and excitement that Tommy McFarlane had been rescued from a Japanese prison camp and was coming home to reclaim his dog from Gleason. Soon after this, it reported there had been a mix-up. The rescued man had the same name, but Lansing's Tommy McFarlane had been lost in the sinking of the USS Houston in 1942 along with 742 other men. On his 85th birthday in 1949, Olds told the Journal he stopped making investments after FDR took office. There has been no incentive considering high taxes, labor difficulties, and the other problems. Reminded that Henry Ford had attended his 75th birthday celebration, Olds said, "Well, he won't be here this time." Ford died in 1947, and Olds would die in 1950. Gleason, the Democrat who wore no man's collar, died that same year. Earl R. Pitt, who wrote for a half-century at the Journal, died in 1956. Every story Pitt wrote about Gleason included a quip about harried borrowers fearful of the hangman at the bank. But the record shows that few knew better than Earl Pitt that Gleason was well liked and known for his generosity. Another who knew was Father O'Rafferty, and as it came out at Gleason's funeral, the bishop and every priest in Lansing and in surrounding communities who approached Gleason to ask his help for a parishioner. Martha's children thrived in post-war America. On Sundays, she cooked traditional Syrian dishes for them, their spouses, and her grandchildren. When a grandchild asked about the tattoo on her hand, she claimed with a straight face that her brothers and sisters all had them so their mother could tell them apart. After she died in 1968, Charlie Haddad, with the same precision he used to make the Napoleonic coach, measured the cutting board his father gave his mother in 1913 and noted its surface was worn to a depth of 3/8 inch. Reminiscing about the Depression, Joe Haddad said, "What depression? Nothing changed for us." Martha's three sons joked about their mother shaking them down for money when they came home from work. Hearing this, Mimi bristled, saying, "She did not," and then, because she knew her mother did, said, "What was Mom supposed to do? She had 3 little girls at home." They hid their smiles, and she too, along with surprise and emotions from way back when. Chapter 5. Seeing Things Differently. After Martha died, I heard the story of the house from the point of view of my uncles. This took place at a meeting of all the aunts and uncles and their spouses. Everyone was at Grandma's house to close out her estate. My Uncle Joe told the story as slapstick, and his brothers George and Charlie added humorous details. The 3 brothers poked fun at one another, acknowledged personal shortcomings, youthful mistakes, and made light of their mother's superstitions and anxieties. The store was described as a place where no one shopped except on weekends. The boys had other ideas about how to spend that time. Mimi and her brothers saw these events differently. Upon reflection, I came to understand that this was due to their respective ages and stations in the family. My mother was 10 when her father died in 1934. Joe turned 22 that year, George 20 and Charlie 18. The crux of Joe's version centered on what happened in 1942, after the refinancing arrangement Gleason brokered was signed and delivered. It focused on the private party loan used to pay off the existing mortgage. The money came from a woman named Alice Walsh. She was Gleason's cousin. Joe explained that Martha soon came to dislike Mrs. Walsh. Martha would walk to her office to make her house payment and thought Alice Walsh looked down her nose at her. She found it humiliating and made the perceived slight no to her sons quickly and frequently. Riposte and Perry were on display as the boys acted out the story. There was the part about Martha shaking them down for money when they came home from work, and my mother's swift rebuke of something she knew was true. I found it so hilarious that my sides hurt from laughing. Mimi, on the other hand, did not see humor in any of this and shot me a look. But here is the plain truth: the older 3 boys took on adult responsibilities while their father was sick and after he died. Each took a turn as the head of the family and all of them worked to support their mother and 3 little sisters. Also true is that Mimi witnessed countless arguments between them and their mother about money from the time she was 10 until Martha went to work at Oldsmobile in 1944. The arrangement, imperfect and always shaky, broke down at the start of the Second World War. Why? Because Joe and George had families and mortgages of their own. A fire at the original residence on Olds Avenue took away a source of rental income, and the draft loomed for Charlie. Mimi was 17 and got a job at the bank. Gleason learned about the fire and that Martha was worried about missing house payments. He was exactly the same person who on the day before Christmas in 1918, in the midst of a coal shortage, offered to take coal from his basement and give it to people with none, saying he didn't want anyone in Lansing to suffer if he could prevent it. He'd been helping struggling borrowers as the receiver of Capital National since 1935. The receivership was ending, and he restructured one last loan on his way out the door. My grandmother's paperwork shows that she owed about $3,300 on the Cedar Street house when she stopped making payments in the middle of 1941. The Olds Avenue boarding house was likely worth no more than $2,000 before the fire in January of 1942. The fire caused $1,000 in damage to the building and $600 to its contents. Martha sold the Olds Avenue house in June. The sale amount is not shown in the paperwork. Historical accounts from the era indicate that insurance companies like Prudential, which held Martha's mortgage note, were more likely to grant forbearance to struggling borrowers than commercial banks. They would also reduce principal balances to reflect lowered market values if offered an immediate payoff. Gleason knew that and put together a deal that included $1,000 from Alice Walsh plus money from the sale of the rooming house. Prudential accepted the deal and wrote off the rest as a loss. Martha now owed Alice Walsh $1,000. Charlie entered the army, and Mimi now contributed to household finances. Problem solved. But now there is a new mystery. The 5-year note was paid off in February of 1944, just 19 months later. Where did the money to pay off the loan come from? In 2020, my Aunt Emmeline told me Joe shocked everyone at the meeting I found so hilarious. At the last minute he said he loaned Martha a sum of money and thought the estate should pay him back. I don't remember this happening and she didn't recall the details, but in my mother's papers there is a note she signed agreeing to pay Joe $1,000. Did Joe loan his mother money in 1944 so she could pay off Alice Walsh? Discussions about the family situation in those years were fraught and complicated by differences in the way my mother and her brothers saw things. They argued about their own history for the rest of their lives, usually but not always, in good spirits. There was even disagreement about Charlie's plan to relocate the Cedar Street house to Ray Street and build a commercial building on the empty lot. In fact, moving the house was prescient as there was soon only commercial real estate on South Cedar. It preserved the house, which now backs up to a city park. My Uncle Joe often looked at Mimi with a bemused smile. Her brother George always treated her like an equal. Her relationship with Charlie was more complicated. I think the reason is because after Joe and George started families of their own and moved out of Grandma's house, the burden of coming up with money to pay bills was borne almost completely by Charlie. One man was trying to support a household that had barely made ends meet when three men shared the responsibility. Then a fire took away an important source of income, the draft loomed, and his little sister involved an outsider in family business, perhaps without discussing it with him first. Charlie was the putative head of the family in 1942. He may have felt slighted, disrespected by his little sister, perhaps betrayed by his mother. He also may have been relieved because at the age of 25, he was finally free to start a life of his own because his mother and three sisters had more financial security. I don't really know. But this is clear, Martha kept her house, started work at Oldsmobile in 1944, and the year after that, became a citizen. Viewed from the present, the nature and sequence of that hat trick is astonishing. Like the novelist L.P. Hartley said, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. Chapter 6. Marks of Identification. Martha was 18 when she came to the United States, a journey that took her by boat from the port of Sidon to Marseille, France, then to Veracruz, Mexico, then by train to Ciudad Porfirio Diaz across the border from Eagle Pass, Texas. On June 29, 1907, she crossed the Rio Grande by footbridge and presented herself at the Eagle Pass immigration station. The temperature was 108 degrees. Through an interpreter, Officer Dodd asked her name. "Martha, daughter of Hannah Elia," she said. The interpreter translated and Dodd wrote Martha Hannah on the inspector report. Hannah, or John, was her father's first name. By custom she would introduce herself as Martha, Hannah's daughter. Seeing your father's first name substituted for your last name was a common confusion experienced by immigrants. The last names of her siblings in the U.S. all became Hannah, John or Johns. The interview continued, documenting her age incorrectly, but not her height, complexion, hair and eye color. Under marks of identification, Dodd noted a tattoo on her right hand and sketched it on the card. Her birthplace was Derdia, Turkey, her nationality Turkish and her race Syrian. It was noted that Martha could not read or write and that her final destination was Douglas, Arizona, where she would meet her brother. Also noted was that her father paid her passage and that she had $98 in her possession. She answered no to questions about whether she had ever been in prison, was a polygamist or an anarchist. Asked if she intended to apply for American citizenship, she answered no, saying she was going to keep house for her brothers and would then return home. She underwent the standard medical exam. It revealed she had trachoma and her entry was denied. It took her 4 tries to get in. On her first 3, the medical examiner found trachoma and sent her back to Mexico. Trachoma was untreatable in 1907, it either became a chronic condition, perhaps causing blindness, or if you were lucky, it went away. She was allowed into Texas on July 30. The temperature was 103 degrees, and she had just $46 left. She might have spent the month in Mexico because she was victim of a scam in which dishonest U.S. border agents collaborated with unscrupulous boarding house owners in Mexico. A ruse like this was exposed at the El Paso border station. Agents there told immigrants they had communicable diseases when they didn't, and boarding house owners fleeced them of money, renting them rooms and selling them fake cures. She might have spent her days there rubbing sugar on her eyelids to mask the visible symptoms of trachoma, a remedy mentioned in accounts by other immigrants who were turned away at the border. Or she might have had trachoma and it went away on its own. Regardless, she was admitted a free alien who stated she was not applying for citizenship. Had she come in 1909 instead of 1907, the question of her race would have had consequences. Then as now, elected officials determined immigration policy and their appointees carried it out. In 1909 the head of U.S. immigration reclassified Syrians as Asian, making them subject to the Asian Exclusion Act of 1882. Here is why that was important. The Naturalization Act of 1870 gave citizenship to freed slaves and their descendants, but other groups, primarily but not limited to Chinese and Japanese immigrants, were ineligible for citizenship and therefore, prohibited from owning land or businesses. People coming in had to be free whites. Also, if you were an Asian, and did something to attract the attention of law enforcement officials, you could be deported under the Asian Exclusion Act of 1882. That happened to a Syrian in California, who came to the attention of authorities who then sought to retroactively strip him of his citizenship and deport him based on his race. He was no longer white, so that was the legal basis for his expulsion. His lawyers cited numerous precedents in his defense, and the man needled his prosecutors, reminding them that, if Syrians aren't white, neither was Jesus. He won his case, but the effect was limited to California. In 1915 another Syrian was in court challenging the denial of his application for naturalization. He also won his case, which was called Dow v. United States. This case settled the matter in the country as a whole. The race of Syrians was changed to white. They could continue to immigrate, own land, and become naturalized citizens. Anti-immigration sentiments persisted and immigration into the U.S. all but ended for everyone in the 1920s. Martha was in Lansing while all this played out elsewhere. She had an arranged marriage to a man from Palestine, and in 1915 Frank bought a house on Olds Avenue. By 1916 Frank and Martha had 3 children. They went back to Syria in 1920, but only to visit. After they returned to Lansing, she had 2 more children, one who she believed died of the evil eye, another from a rat bite, and then Mimi, Madeline and Emmeline were born. Frank died in 1934, leaving a small life insurance policy and a paid-up house. Money from the policy capitalized a grocery store operated by Mimi's brothers. Martha bought a house on South Cedar Street and turned the Olds Avenue property into a boarding house. It became an important ongoing source of support for the family. I need to step into the story at this point and say why I am taking the time to lay all this out. Without Dow v. United States, it is possible that Frank and Martha Haddad would not have been able to buy the house on Olds Avenue. What is certain is that they would have been ineligible to become naturalized citizens. Had they continued to be considered Asian, Frank could have been deported when he was arrested for picketing in 1912. Or the entire family could have been expelled when George Haddad got into a fist fight with a policeman in 1939. It sounds absurd and seems implausible, but it was happening to Syrians after 1909. Think about our own era, where powerful information technology allows law enforcement entities to coordinate between jurisdictions. Immigrants deemed illegal today, some retroactively due to electoral wins like the ones that turned Syrians from white to Asian, are arrested for minor infractions and deported. The importance of real estate as a foundational way of building intergenerational wealth cannot be overstated. Contrast Frank and Martha's situation with that of black families in Lansing during that era. The Naturalization Act of 1870 gave citizenship to freed slaves and their descendants, but people in states and localities throughout the country used restrictive covenants based on race to prevent black people from buying houses or operating businesses in certain areas. When the Haddads lived on Olds Avenue, their neighbors on either side were black. Given its proximity to Oldsmobile, Olds Avenue was likely an area where blacks and Syrians were allowed to buy homes, but an area developed later just a few blocks to the northwest near Sexton High School, was subject to restrictive covenants, as were other parts of Lansing and the entire city of East Lansing. 2 months after the imagined story about Frank sitting on his porch on a summer night, a tragedy befell a black minister named Earl Little and his family. Reverend Little had bought a house outside the city because a covenant kept him from living where he wanted in Lansing, and in September of 1931, Reverend Little was run over by a streetcar. According to the State Journal, it was an accident. According to his family and the congregation he served, Reverend Little was murdered by the Klan. After the Haddads moved to South Cedar Street, Madeline Haddad went to a new school, and she said that Reverend Little's son Malcolm sat across the aisle from her. Malcolm grew up, left Lansing and became Malcolm X. Among the things he was vocal about were real estate covenants in Lansing and the way his family was treated. An excerpt from an editorial from the April 20, 1933 State Journal provides a glimpse into attitudes about black people in Lansing that persisted well into the 1960s when I was growing up. That colored people, despite their worth and ability, have a difficult situation among an overwhelming white population, no one can deny. But a particular phase of that ability, which has stood the race in good stead, has been the imperturbable good nature of the colored people. Eddie West has celebrated the worth of the lift of the chin with a bit of a grin. But the colored man and colored woman have gone further than that. They have plugged along in the hard going, not with a grin but with a good-natured, deep chuckle. Colored people have their burdens and their handicaps vastly more than their white neighbors pause to realize, but how much better they are getting along with their peculiar trials, because of their imperturbable good nature than as though they were a surly race. There is no one formula that can be stated, nor one action that can be thought of, to render the racial relationship between blacks and whites ideal. The better conditions must be attained by patience and growth, and nothing will help more to that end than continued good nature and patience on the part of colored people. In 1940 the State Journal reported the death in Lansing of Henry Sweet, who it said 15 years earlier caused trouble when he moved into a white neighborhood in Detroit. His white neighbors rioted, and the Journal said that as a result of the riotous outbreak a neighbor was shot and he, Sweet, was charged with murder. Clarence Darrow defended Sweet and he was acquitted. Lansing's restrictive covenants persisted until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Stuart Dunnings, founder of Lansing's first black-owned law firm, personally broke the covenant on Lansing's west side, and Robert L. Greene, education professor at MSU, did the same in East Lansing. Both rejected the Journal's notion that good nature and patience were the only way forward. Instead of waiting for hearts and minds to change, both worked for laws and rules to bring black people closer to justice and equality. Frank and Martha were able to buy and own property because of Dow v. United States, or put another way, because of laws and rules. The right of black U.S. citizens to live where they wanted did not come until passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Laws and rules ended redlining and restrictive covenants based on race, religion, national origin, sex, handicap, and familial status nationwide. It happened 49 years after Syrian immigrants were granted the same rights along with the right to apply for naturalization. It happened 95 years after freed slaves and their descendants were made U.S. citizens. John Adams held to the view we lived in a nation governed by laws, not men. But laws and rules are made by people. The judge in the case of Henry Sweet was Michigan's Frank Murphy. In 1937, as governor of Michigan, Murphy ordered the National Guard into Flint to protect striking workers, a decision that led to recognition of the UAW. A person in authority with a different disposition could have ordered the Guard to clear out the protesters. Different person, different outcome. Germany was a liberal democracy in 1923 when Hitler led an insurrection against the Bavarian government. He was sentenced to 5 years, served 9 months and clawed his way back into power. The party gained control of the government without achieving an electoral majority. The majority of German people thought the courts would save them from the Nazis. They were wrong. After Hitler became chancellor, it took just 6 months to neutralize the courts and dismantle Germany's democracy. More than half the people of the United States witnessed an insurrection on January 6, 2021. The rest saw something else. Elected officials who know better continue to spread lies about a stolen election. The Nazis did the same thing on their way to power. Mark Twain said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Epilogue. Gleason and Olds are linked in the creation of an organization removed from the making of paint, motor cars and the liquidation of failed banks. Both men were associated with Lansing hospitals, Gleason with St. Lawrence, Olds with Sparrow. The Depression left hospitals with less revenue and with reduced sources of philanthropy to support uncompensated care. In 1938, Gleason and Olds were approached for a donation by people crafting legislation to establish an organization to mitigate the problem. They contributed $5,000. Henry Ford was also approached and gave $10,000. In 1939 Blue Cross of Michigan was incorporated. Gleason, Olds and Ford are the only individual donors identified in its archives. Acknowledgements. Researching events surrounding Olds Capital National Bank would not have been possible without online access to the archives of the Lansing State Journal. Information from the Federal Reserve about the Emergency Banking Act of 1933 was critical to gaining a deeper understanding of the arcane world of banks, receiverships and provided context for this account. Ancestry.com was the source of my grandmother's immigration record, and her few papers included the details of how Gleason helped when she had a problem with her house. Tricia Franco Gehring located records about the house Frank Haddad bought for the family in 1915. A special thanks to David Haddad for editorial comments. I would like to acknowledge and thank David O'Leary for his kindness, generosity and patience answering my questions about Joseph W. Gleason and his father Vincent, two men of their time. Last but hardly least, I acknowledge the work of the journalist Hurl R. Pitt, whose stories about Gleason pepper this account, and are coated in irony an inch thick. If you have enjoyed this audiobook and wish to purchase a paperback copy complete with photographs, please visit Amazon.com and search for Once Upon a Time in Lansing by Bruce Philip Miller. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this account of the failure and receivership of the Capital National Bank.